Hey everybody, I hope you're all doing well. I've got another pre-recorded lecture for you here to work through for the second section in chapter 5, the section on Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who are existentialists proper here. So this presentation will cover both of those thinkers and the things you ought to be thinking about along the way, or how they are similar to and different from Nietzsche. And then also keep in mind their views to contrast with the next chapter on the ethics of the other. So just to review a little bit here, last lecture we covered Nietzsche. We saw that Nietzsche he criticizes traditional moral theory. He also criticizes the traditional content of much of morality as well, Western morality, in terms of it being life-denying and a form of resentment, and then posits the overman as this rare type of individual that's capable of engaging in a kind of self-mastery, right? So that overman has been interpreted different ways, and of course, one interpretation that's sometimes given is that it's a view that it's an ideal individual that looks like an immoralist ideal, actually, because it looks like he's trying to dominate everyone else. The interpretation that your textbook favors, and that I'm pretty much in agree with as well, is the idea that it's more about self-mastery than mastering of others. And so the Übermensch serves as kind of placeholder for any kind of self-overcoming and self-mastery, overcoming of resentment and self-mastery, and enhancing one's own capacities, right? And we'll see some of those similar themes pop up again here with the existentialist ethics. Once again, they have an approach to ethics, an alternative approach to ethics, that emphasizes self-creation rather than comporting oneself primarily as a response to the other, which is that's what the next chapter is really about. So recall that we have what we're looking at in these next two chapters are alternative approaches to ethical theory. Well, alternatives to what? Well, keep in mind our mainstream moral theories that we've been looking at, especially utilitarianism and deontology. So they again, just to review, share some common features. In terms of meta-ethics, those two traditional approaches, and most traditional approaches, assume some form of moral objectivism. Secondly, in terms of normative ethics, they all tend to presuppose or aim at identifying and defending a single standard to guide conduct or good living. They give us, in utilitarianism and deontology, we get decision procedures, universalizability test, calculation of hedons and happiness units, that's supposed to give it the air of objectivity. Well, with regard to Nietzsche, we saw that he rejected objectivism in ethics. That's why there's not one way to be an Übermensch or one criteria for a well-lived life, according to Nietzsche. And we have the similar things with regard to the existentialist. They're going to call into question much of the traditional foundations of mainstream moral theory, as well as some of the content of morality. And so we're not going to get a decision procedure out of them. We're not going to get an algorithm, a moral algorithm, to help us address the murderer at the door scenario or the trolley problem. And so, again, that's one way in which they're different than these other theories, also a way in which they're frustrating compared to the standpoint of those other theories. So again, we might worry about whether they're really giving us a theory properly understood or technically understood. And of course, these other traditional mainstream moral theories tend to presuppose fairly abstract versions or views about what a moral reasoner is, right? And so the existentialists are going to be much more focused on the particular identity of individuals rather than an abstract conception of the moral reasoner. And so let's turn now to look at a few of these features, and we'll start with Jean-Paul Sartre. And so I mentioned here it's the ethics of authenticity. Notice that notion of authenticity, of being true to oneself, one's unique self, or creating a unique lifestyle for oneself, those were ideas that were largely left out of or ignored, not just ignored, but downplayed purposefully by the other moral theories because they're attempting to provide these objectivist, universalist moral theories. Well, Sartre is going to be much more interested in this idea of personal authenticity. And so existentialism, what does that mean? Well, it's probably not fair to say that existentialism is dead, but it's certainly not in its heyday anymore as a school of philosophy. But in the middle of the 20th century, especially after World War II, it was an intellectual, philosophical, artistic, and even social movement that originated and flourished in Europe. So when I say existentialist proper, like Simone de Beauvoir, although Nietzsche had an influence on the existentialist and Kierkegaard had an influence, 19th century thinkers had influenced the 20th century existentialist, I tend to think of existentialism proper as a post-World War II movement. And so that includes thinkers like Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Jaspers, and Merleau-Ponty, just to list off a couple other names, maybe Marcel Proust, Gabriel Marcel, these kinds of thinkers. So it's a school of philosophy or an intellectual movement that really emphasized the human condition, the question of the meaning of life or the purpose of human existence, more so than other approaches to philosophy. And it does have some central themes. Again, it emphasizes the individual and subjective orientation or vantage point of the individual. It tends to emphasize this idea that human beings are radically free. And it tends to talk less about human nature metaphysically than it talks about the human condition and the relationship of the human condition to the question of meaning. And so it often invokes ideas of absurdity, despair, anxiety, nihilism, and how is it that we're going to give meaning to our lives in more of an individualist and subjectivist way than previous moral theories. Right? And so Sartre is a key example here. Kind of one of the defining features of existentialism, Sartre put in the form of a slogan, this idea that existence precedes essence. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. And then here are some key ideas from Sartre. The distinction between being in itself and being for itself is important. Related to that, the idea that existence precedes essence rather than essence preceding existence, which is how the Platonists and much of Western philosophy up till Sartre's point kind of thought about things. And so there's a real key point that makes him an alternative approach, is that he's kind of turning the Western philosophical tradition on its head there. We're going to have this idea that we're condemned to be free. That's a famous slogan out of Sartre. We'll need to think about how that involves the notion of responsibility. We will want to talk about the relationship between existentialism and humanism there. And the big kind of thing in Sartre's ethics is this idea that we have bad faith on the one hand and authenticity on the other. So just like in Nietzsche, where we had slave morality versus the Übermensch, right? Here we're going to have bad faith versus authenticity. And then we'll also have this idea of the other starting to pop up here. That'll be really prevalent in the next chapter, but connected in Sartre's thinking, the idea of the other, or the idea that the other or other people are hell, right? There's a slogan that comes from him. We'll want to worry about that and the way that this idea of the look and objectification figures in Sartre's thinking in terms of how we are to understand social relationships according to this approach, according to his version of existentialism. That notion of the relationship between the self and the other, or others, is very important in continental philosophy, European philosophy, 20th, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries. And figures centrally in the next chapter as well. Here we have an approaches to ethics that tend to emphasize self-creation. And so the self is the starting point for ethical reflection, as opposed to the encounter with the other being the starting point for ethical reflection. We'll see that really come to the forefront in the next chapter. All right, so first, Sartre's notion of bad faith. So he says, so bad faith is this kind of, that's his negative appraisal of much of Western morality and in the human condition in large. So he says, so what does he mean by bad faith? Here's a passage out of, or a couple of passages really, out of Being and Nothingness, his main philosophical work. So I pulled out this quote here. The situation can be the same for bad faith if this, as we have said, is indeed a lie to oneself. So bad faith for Sartre is a form of self-deception. It's lying to oneself, as opposed to lying to others. Right? although it might involve that as well. It's primarily an attempt to lie to oneself. So he says, to be sure, the one who practices bad faith is hiding a displeasing truth or presenting truth as an unpleasing truth. Bad faith is in appearance the structure of falsehood. Only what changes everything is the fact that in bad faith, it is from myself that I am hiding the truth. Thus, the duality of the deceiver and the deceived does not exist here. Bad faith, on the contrary, implies the essence, in essence, the unity of a single consciousness. So it's lying to oneself. We'll want to worry about, well, lying about what to oneself, exactly. And then he gives an example of bad faith. So this is a famous example from out of Sartre's work here, involving a waiter who is not real happy with their job, right? But doesn't change jobs, right? So he says, let us consider this waiter in the cafe. His movement is quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He bends forward a little too eagerly. His voice, his eyes express an interest a little too solicitous for the order of the customer. Finally, there he returns, trying to imitate in his walk the inflexible stiffness of some kind of automation while carrying his tray with the recklessness of a tightrope walker by putting it in a perpetual, unstable, perpetually broken equilibrium, which he perpetually reestablishes by the light of his movement of the arm of the arm in the hand. All his behavior seems to us a game. He applies himself to the changing his movements as if they were mechanisms. So he's not treating himself like an agent. He's acting more like a robot playing a role, an automaton playing a role. So he says he applies himself to changing his movements as if they were mechanisms. The one regulating the other, his gestures and even his voice seems to be a mechanism. He gives himself the quickness and pitiless rapidity of things. He is playing. He is amusing himself. But what is he playing? We need not watch long before we can explain it. He's playing at being a waiter in a cafe. There's nothing there to surprise us. So this notion that I mentioned at the outset of being for itself and being in itself is like the existence of a thing, strictly speaking, an object, right? And nothing more. Whereas Sartre thinks the truth about the human condition is that we are being for itself. We are open-ended and looking into the future, and we have to project ourselves, right, into the future. So our interest is open. Our existence is open-ended. Human subjectivity is open-ended, right? So that's a key idea here. The waiter is treating himself more like an object, a waiter, reducing his being to a role, right? And so think about this idea of existence preceding essence, right? We can make sense of that notion by thinking about Plato, right? In Plato, what is most real are the essences of things, the abstract, non-natural ideas, right? The idea of chairness, right? That's the form of chairness. So for Plato and much of the Western history of philosophy following from him, the things that are most real are these abstract essences, right? That exist either in this otherworldly realm, right? This metaphysical realm. And then individuals in the material world, they're just instantiations of this general idea, right? This abstract idea. Well, Sartre turns that on its head. He says, what we discover first in the world is that we're thrown into the world without any defining features, and we have to make ourselves. So what he means is, first, we realize that we exist, and second, after the fact, we try to form ourselves as an essence, right? We make ourselves. So this waiter, he's reducing his existence to the role of the waiter, right? That's what Sartre's getting at here. He's playing at being a waiter. He's fulfilling a role, right? There's nothing left to surprise us there. He's just performing this social function. So the idea here is that elsewhere in the passage, the waiter's not happy with his job, but what he does is he denies his freedom to change his job, right? So he's treating himself as more of a thing than as than an agent, right, in the world. So think about Pickle Rick here, right? Pickle Rick, or what Rick does is turn himself into a pickle to avoid therapy, to avoid confronting an uncomfortable situation, right, that he wants with himself. I don't know if you've ever seen these old reality TV shows, The Real World. It used to be on MTV. I don't know if they're still on MTV or not anymore, but there was this episode on the Italian version of it when they went to Italy and sent these kids from New Jersey that had been on a previous season to Italy. And this one person on the reality TV show was called Snooki, and she gets in a fight with her boyfriend who's elsewhere. She's having a long distance relationship. She gets intoxicated and then messes around with one of the roommates, but then denies that she did that to everyone, including the people that know that she did that. And when they confront her about it, she says, "You're not being a good friend right now." Well, it becomes clear in the episode that what she means by being a good friend is going along with her attempt to lie to herself about what she did, right? And Pickle Rick looks like the example of the same sort of bad faith, that what Rick does is turn himself into a pickle so he can't go to therapy. And in doing so is lying to himself about his radical freedom. So consider this a pretty good example of Sartre's idea of bad faith. And in that Pickle Rick episode, which you should definitely watch, there's a link to it up on Moodle as well. Here's what the therapist says to Rick when she does get a chance to confront him. Here's her diagnosis. She said, here's Dr. Wong as the character. She says, "Rick, the only connection between your unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying your family is that everyone in your family, you included, uses intelligence to justify the sickness. You seem to alternate between viewing your own mind as an unstoppable force and an inescapable curse. And I think it's because the only truly unapproachable concept for you is that it's your mind within your control. You choose to come here, you choose to walk to the little my vocation, just as you choose to become a pickle. You are the master of your universe, and yet you are dripping with rat blood and feces," because he's gone through this whole ordeal in the course of the episode. "Your enormous mind literally vegetating by your own hand. I have no doubt that you would be bored senseless by therapy, the same way that I'm bored when I brush my teeth and wipe my ass. Because the thing about repairing, maintaining, and cleaning is it's not an adventure. There's no way to do it so wrong that you might die. It's just work. And at the bottom line is some people are okay going to work and some people would rather die. Each of us gets to choose, right? So the idea here is that Rick is denying, by turning himself into pickle, he's trying to deny the fact that he had a choice about whether to go to therapy, family therapy or not, right? Lying to oneself. It's a bad faith, right? So we can contrast that notion of bad faith with a notion of authenticity. Usually what that means is kind of being true to oneself, right? For Sartre, it has that connotation, but there's something a little more significant about it as well. So we want to get to that point here. And so now I'm pulling out a few quotations out of his essay, Existentialism as a Humanism, which was written for a popular audience, in which he tries to outline his existentialism. And of course, humanism has moral connotations to it, right? So Sartre is one of these thinkers that's often viewed again as a bad philosopher because he seems to not present very good arguments and deals with these questions of the meaning of life that are often put to the side by much of academic philosophy. And so here we have Sartre trying to defend his view in a popular forum, in a popular essay. Again, I pulled out a few quotations here, and key to this essay is going to be his notion of freedom, right? And his notion of humanism and how they inform our notion of authenticity, or a notion of authenticity and authentic existence. So he says, there are two kinds of existentialism. One of them is an atheistic existentialism. So Nietzsche is really the grandfather or father of that strain of existentialism. And Kierkegaard is kind of the father of theistic existentialism. And Sartre puts himself in the atheistic camp. So he says, atheistic existentialism, of which I am a representative, declares with greater consistency that if God does not exist, then there is at least one being whose existence comes before essence, a being which exists before it can be defined by any conception of it. This being is man, or human beings, right? As Heidegger would have it, human reality. What do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean, first of all, that man exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and then defines himself afterwards. Right? So the project of human subjectivity is to define oneself. We are not defined in advance of existing by some otherworldly metaphysical conception of human nature like it was in Plato or even Aristotle or even in Kant and Mill. Right? So we mean that first of all, man exists and then defines himself afterwards. So that's, again, that's a reversal of the usual way of thinking about things in Western philosophy. So if man, as the existentialist sees him, is not definable, it is because, to begin with, he is nothing. Sartre's book that I was just quoting the bad faith passages out of is called Being and Nothingness. So he will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. So there's our self-creation, right? There is no human nature because there is no God to have a conception of it. Man simply is. Not that he simply is what he conceives himself to be, but is what he wills. And he conceives himself after already existing, as he wills to be after that leap towards existence. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. That's the first principle of existentialism. So existentialism, really in the, even in the theistic view, there's a God in the theistic view, obviously, but it's a radically different way of relating to God. You relate to God through subjective choice, self-making, even in Kierkegaard. So this is the first key thing about existentialism, is that that we are left to define ourselves after we realize that we are an existing being. So that's the idea of existence preceding essence. First, we come to confront our own existence, and then afterwards we define ourselves. There's no preordained or pre-established definition of how to be a human being or how to be an individual human being. So he goes on there. There can no longer be any good a priori. Think of Plato there. Think of Kant there, even. Or Aristotle's essence that's just in the material world, right? So since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it, it is nowhere written that the good exists, that one must be honest or must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only human beings. So he quotes Dostoevsky here, who once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And that for existentialism is the starting point. Everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist, and man, in his own consequence, forlorn, for he cannot find anything to depend on, either within or outside of himself. He discovers forthwith that he is without excuse. So you see, first of all, here, why people, a lay person or even other philosophers might get a little weary about existentialism here, because it looks like there's no principle to justifiably limit or constrain my self-creation, the activities that I might engage in. So whereas in contractarianism, even though that was egoistic, there was still an attempt to justify a constraint on what I might do to pursue my own self-interest, since I have to work with others, right? In utilitarianism, the harm principle gives us a plausible criteria for constraining individual freedom. The same is true with the categorical imperative, just in a different way than the harm principle, right? So in utilitarianism, I'm free to do whatever I want until my actions produce more harm in the world than they bring about good. In Kant, I have individual freedom, but I have to refrain from treating myself and others as mere means. But there doesn't seem to be any principled way of constraining action according to Nietzsche's view. The Übermensch gets to do whatever he wants, it seems like, to engage in self-mastery. And here it looks like the existentialist is saying that there's no justified constraint on what I can do to create myself, to be authentic, right? And so that's the real worry here. A lot of, especially in this chapter, that the emphasis is so much on self-creation and self-mastery and individual authenticity that there doesn't seem to be any principled stance for limiting that in any way, for limiting my individual freedom in any way. So there's no a priori good, no a priori bad, there's no God, so everything is permitted. So again, this looks like I mentioned at the outset in the lecture on the alternative approaches to ethics. This is the big worry about a lot of these alternative approaches, is that it looks like there's no justifiable constraint, no principled constraint on self-creation or individual freedom. All right, so then he goes on. For if indeed existence precedes essence, one will never be able to explain one's action by reference to a specific human nature. In other words, there's no determinism. Man is free. Man is freedom. So that's that notion of being for itself as opposed to being in itself. Being in itself is literally the kind of existence that things have, like this mouse or a pen has, right? So it's been shaped and formed to have a purpose or a function because some other being created it that way. But human beings are radically free. There's no preordained by God or by nature, a human nature that tells us how to live. So that's radically different than everything we've looked up to, just about everything we've looked at up to this point this semester. So he says, nor on the other hand, if God does not exist, are we provided with any values or commands that could legitimize our behavior. So it's not like abstract reason, like in Kant, is going to be able to do that in Sartre's view. He says, thus we have neither behind us nor before us, in a luminous realm of values, any means of justification or excuse. We are left alone without excuse. That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, right? You didn't choose whether or not to exist. You just found yourself existing, right? Yet is nevertheless at liberty. And from the moment that he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything he does. So this is an interesting thing. I've presented this notion that there's no principled constraint on self-creation in Sartre, but he still says that we're radically responsible for ourselves. Because we're radically free, we're radically responsible for whatever we do. So you can see how he's viewing bad faith as a negative thing, a negative characteristic or disposition or way of being in the world, because it's a way of existing where we treat ourselves as if we are things or just social roles rather than radically free individuals. So we're starting to get a glimpse of his notion of what is involved in authenticity. It's not just simply being true to one's self. It's a recognition that one is a radically free individual, right? First and foremost, a radically free individual. So that means accepting that burden of freedom as opposed to trying to deny it. Pickle Rick. So subjectivism means, on the one hand, the freedom of the individual subject. On the other, that man cannot pass beyond human subjectivity. So I've talked about subjectivism and relativism a lot especially earlier in the semester, right? And there it's usually treated as a position on the nature of morality, right? Where it's denying that there's any kind of objective or universal moral truths, prescriptive truths, right? And Sartre has that idea in mind, but he also has this notion that by subjective, what he means is that even if you're an objectivist about morality, a Kantian, that you're still trapped in a subjective standpoint, a vantage point, that we cannot escape our bodies or escape our limited perspective on things. Right? And so he says subjectivism means, on the one hand, the freedom of the individual subject, and on the other, that there is no ideal standpoint that we can achieve from which to evaluate things. So he said, it is the latter which is the deeper meaning of existentialism, that we can't pass beyond our limited standpoint. Nietzsche, although I didn't talk about it then, he did this sort of thing as well. He said that everything is a matter of perspective. We're all locked in a particular vantage point in the world, right, from which we have to evaluate things. So there's no God's eye standpoint. There's no impartial, real self to evaluate things impartially, right? We're all trapped in our subjectivity. So he says, when we say that man chooses himself, we do mean that every one of us must choose himself. But by that, we also mean that in choosing for himself, he chooses for all men. For in effect, all of the actions of man may take in order to create himself, all the actions that you can take in order to create yourself, you're willing yourself, right? There is not one which is not creative. At the same time, an image of man such as he believes he ought to be. So this is where we get to the idea of existentialism, which has been emphasizing individualism, subjectivism, and my own unique standpoint in the world. This is where we get to the humanism part. Humanism is, about humanity writ large, right? So what Sartre's saying here is that when I choose for myself, I'm not only choosing a value for myself, an action for myself, or projecting value as I see it, I'm also providing a model for everyone else, right? So to choose is to affirm a value, right? And in choosing a value, Sartre's claiming that we're not just choosing for our little old lonesome selves, but choosing how we ought to be. Notice the use of the we there, right? So he says to choose between this or that is at the same time to affirm a value of which, that the value of what is chosen. So if I choose to go play a video game, to just cut off this lecture right now and go play a video game, I'm making a value choice about what's important, right? The video game is more important than the lecture, right? So to choose this or that is at the same time to affirm the value of what is chosen. For we are unable ever to choose the worse. What we choose is always the better. This is the weird thing about Sartre, and what drives a lot of people up the wall. Is like, obviously you can make bad choices, right, Sartre? So he says, nothing can be better for us unless it is better for all. If, moreover, existence precedes essence, and we will to exist at the same time as we fashion our image, that image is valid for all and for us, for the entire epoch in which we find ourselves. Our responsibility is thus much greater than we had supposed, for it concerns all of mankind. Right? So this is, the issue here is that it's not clear, given that Sartre has rejected human nature, rejected God, what is it that could possibly justify then the idea that I'm choosing for more than myself, but I'm choosing for everyone in terms of the valuations that I make? Can Sartre really have it both ways? Hasn't he undermined the traditional foundations of humanism, right? But still trying to have all the humanist values, right? So that looks like a problem. That looks like a contradiction in Sartre. If you're going to reject the traditional foundations of universal morality, of humanism, then it looks like you have to give up on that humanism, that when you're choosing, that you're choosing for everybody. Why can't it be that I'm just choosing for myself? So he goes on then, furthermore, although it is impossible to find in each and every man a universal essence that can be called human nature, there is nevertheless the human universality of the human condition. So maybe this is what can solve it, that tension that I just elucidated before. So he says it's not by chance that the thinkers of today are so much more ready to speak of the condition than of the nature of man. By this condition, they understand with more or less clarity all the limitations which a priori define man's fundamental situation in the universe. His historical situations are variable. Man may be born a slave in a pagan society, or maybe a feudal baron or a proletarian, lower class individual, socioeconomically speaking. But what never vary are the necessities of being in the world, of having to labor and to die there. So one of the things that Sartre does, and that he takes from the phenomenological school of philosophy, is an attempt to describe rigorously the structures of the human condition. So we're in the world, we're future oriented. He talks about this in terms of facticity. So there are some limitations that we have about how we're in the world, right, and that structure our world. There are some facts about our condition. And so to turn back to another pop culture example here, the book uses crimes and misdemeanors, and the Woody Allen character here, the character on the right, Woody Allen is the writer and director of the film and many films, but he was also a philosophy major. And you see at the end of the film, him adopt a very existentialist perspective. He says, he's talking about a movie idea that he has with Judah here, the other character, and Woody Allen's character Cliff expresses an existentialist view that, in the absence of God, the only body that we have to hold ourselves accountable to is basically ourselves. Authenticity. So what does it mean to be an authentic individual for Sartre? Well, it means first and foremost recognizing that you are a unique self, but that you are a radically free self, and then having to accept responsibility for all your choices rather than living in bad faith. So you've got to create a unique existence for yourself and be true to yourself, but that can't be denying that you were condemned to be free, that having to choose is the one thing that you don't have a choice about. You have to accept, right, to be authentic and to create oneself, the responsibility of doing so. Right? So Sartre would even go so far as to say that I'm responsible for being bald. If I'm upset about being a bald man, I ought to go get hair plugs or wear a wig. And that, you know, I shouldn't get depressed about that. I should take responsibility for those actions, right? Or the way that I'm existing in the world. So that's a little bit about Sartre. The early Sartre of Being in Time and Existentialism as a Humanism, again, kind of presents authenticity as this radical form of individualism. The problem with Sartre is that he seems to ignore the social dimension of individuals. And so to pick up on that a little bit, I have a discussion here of the other in Sartre. So the Sartre's ethics are oriented around, you know, the self-creation. That's obviously an influence from Nietzsche. So what does he have to say about the role that others play, right? So here's where we get a kind of bizarre example from Sartre and his notion of the other and his idea of the look. And what this is getting at is his slogan that hell is other people, or other people are hell, right? And so we want to try and make some sense about what that might mean here. So here's Sartre's kind of creepy example of a man looking in a keyhole and getting caught looking in a keyhole. I have a personal anecdote here. One time that fits very well with this idea of Sartre's, of the look and the other. So let me give my anecdotal example first, and then we'll turn to Sartre's example. Many years ago, my wife and I were walking through the French Quarter, and we turned down one of the darker streets, and on the sidewalk, there was a man who was engrossed in looking through a gap in a gate into a courtyard, right? So if you've ever been in the French Quarter, you know that there are these old courtyards they've been there for, you know, centuries. And there was a man peeking through a gate and looking at something on the inside. As soon as he saw us walking, he probably saw us out of his peripheral vision, and he jerked his head towards us and immediately took off walking in the opposite direction. And we were coming towards that gate. And so we were like, well, that's really odd. Well, we walked by the courtyard, and we could hear noises of what was going on in the courtyard. And I'm not going to go all the way into it, but it was some people that were engaged in romantic activity, let's say. I'm trying to put it as diplomatically as possible since we're in class. And this guy shot off. So basically this guy was a peeping Tom, right? So think about what his actions were like in that scenario, and think about what these passages that I'm about to read from Sartre on the look, right? So his example is very close to my anecdotal example. His example is of a man looking through a keyhole. So again, somebody up to some creepy behavior, right? So he says, let us imagine that moved by jealousy, curiosity, or vice, I have just glued my ear to the door and looked through a keyhole. I am alone and on the level of a non-theoretic self-consciousness. So the idea here is that I'm just so engrossed in what I'm looking at, in my own thoughts and feelings, my own subjectivity, right? That I'm kind of I'm not paying attention or not aware of what's going on around me all the time. I'm not really attuned to anything other than myself and what I'm looking at through the keyhole. Not me through the keyhole, what this person's looking through the keyhole. I don't look through keyholes. So he says, this means, first of all, that there is no self to inhabit my consciousness, nothingness, right? Nothing, therefore, to which I can refer my acts in order to qualify them. They are in no way known. I am my acts, and hence they carry in themselves their whole justification. I'm a pure consciousness of things and things caught up in the circuit of my selfness. offer to me their potentialities as the proof of my non-thetic consciousness of my own possibilities. This means that behind the door, a spectacle is presented as to be seen, a conversation to be heard. The door, the keyhole, are at once both instruments and obstacles. They are presented as to be handled with care. The keyhole is given, and he's quoting here, to be looked through close by and with by a little no one's side, and so forth, right? So hence from this moment, I do what I have to do. No transcending view comes to confer upon my acts the character of a given in which a judgment can be brought to bear. My consciousness sticks to my acts. It is my acts, my actions, right? So, and my actions are commanded only by the ends to be attained, by the instruments to be employed. So there's like a sense of instrumental rationality there. I am just my acts, and they're trying to attain this goal of looking through this keyhole, right? So he says, my attitude, for example, has no outside. It is pure consciousness. So it's just wrapped up in my own interiority, again, wrapped up in my own subjectivity. It is a pure process of relating the instrument, the keyhole, to the end to be obtained, the spectacle to be seen, a pure mode of losing myself in the world, of causing myself to be drunk in by the things as ink is by a blotter, in order that an instrumental complex oriented towards an end may be synthetically detached on the ground of the world. So the idea here is that I'm just so engrossed in what I'm doing that I'm not paying attention to what's outside of me. There's just me, the door, the keyhole, and this other event, right, going on. So here's where we get the look, right? The look comes from outside of myself, engrossed in what I'm doing. So he says, but all of a sudden I hear footsteps in the hall. Someone is looking at me. What does this mean? It means that I am suddenly affected in my being, and that essential modifications appear in my structure, modifications which I can apprehend and fix conceptually by means of a reflective cogito. There's a typo here in my presentation. That should be a reflective cogito. Cogito, Sartre, thinking self. First of all, I now exist for myself. First of all, I now exist as myself for my unreflective consciousness. It is this eruption of the self which has been most often described. I see myself because somebody sees me, as it is usually expressed. So think about the guy that we saw when we were walking down the street. He was engrossed in his activity. As soon as he recognizes that someone else sees him, he sees himself as they see him, right? So the person that's the peeping Tom through the keyhole, when they're just engrossed in their activity, they're not a peeping Tom, right? They're just them by themselves. But then all of a sudden, when they recognize someone else see them, there's where they become the peeping Tom, right? And they see themselves, not just as being engrossed in their own activity, but they see themselves through the eyes of someone else, right? That's the look, that's the other. So he says, the unreflective consciousness does not apprehend the person directly or as its object. The person is presented to consciousness insofar as the person is an object for the other. Notice the term he uses, not a subject for the other, an open-ended subject, but a thing for the other, right? Objectification, right? We've seen that pop up before in the semester. Sartre has an account of objectification, just the way it's not all that radically different, although it is significantly different, but it still has this idea. I mean, think about Kant, right? And objectification, treating people like things rather than rational agents. So a connection, more of a similarity there than a difference with some of the other aspects of modern moral theory that these alternative approaches have departed from. So he says, this means that all of a sudden I am conscious of myself as escaping myself, my non-thetic self, not in that I am the foundation of my own nothingness, but in that I have my foundation outside of myself. I am for myself only as I am pure reference to the other. And then second passage here. Now shame, as we noted at the beginning of this chapter, is shame of self. It is the recognition of the fact that I am indeed the object which the other is looking at and judged. I can be ashamed only as my freedom escapes me in order to become a given object. So again, the self that's radically subjective, right, and just engrossed in itself, versus a self that is what it is in virtue of being seen by others. Objectification. hell is other people because they objectify me, right? So he says, I grasp the other's look at the very center of my own act as the solidification and alienation of my own possibilities. In fear or in anxious or in imprudent anticipation, I perceive that these possibilities, which I am and which are the condition of my transcendence, are given also to another, given as about to be transcended to some, in some by its own possibilities. The other, as I look, is only that my transcendence transcended. Transcendence is the idea of going beyond, right? Of course, I still am my own possibilities in the mode of non-theotic consciousness of these possibilities, but at the same time, the look alienates me from them. So the idea that Sartre's trying to get at here is that, you know, sometimes we have a conception of ourself that is internalized from others. So you may have had this experience in your life sometime where other people believe something is true of you. You maybe think it's not true of you, but it seems hard to escape their impression of yourself, right? They won't let you be anything other than that thing, right? So many college kids are in this situation right now. They are their parents' children, and their parents won't let them be anything other than that thing, right? Or maybe you did one bad act sometime that other people saw, and then they only see you as that one bad act. You're being alienated from your other possibilities, right? And so insofar as I internalize that look of the other and become just that thing, just that waiter, right? Just that peeping Tom, just a professor, right? I'm alienated from the fact that my future is open-ended and has many possibilities to it, right? So there's a little bit about Sartre and the other. I'm going to pause here for just a second. In fact, you can pause here as well and take a breather before we get going to the next section on Simone de Beauvoir.